San Antonio International Airport's medical clinic smells of hand sanitizer and recycled air, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Megan O'Brien moves through the space like fog, present but unnoticed. Her navy scrubs are pressed with military precision. Her badge reads RN, Trauma Specialist, above a photo taken 3 months ago, before the assignment, before Derek Voss noticed her asking questions she shouldn't know to ask. She restocks the crash cart with unusual care. Each needle sorted by gauge. Each medication vial positioned exactly where muscle memory expects it. The 14-gauge angiocath needles get her attention longest. She holds one up to the light, checking the bevel angle, then sets it down with the deliberation of someone who's used them before. Not in training. In the field. The jacket hanging on the back of her locker is ordinary issue from the clinic supply closet. But sewn into the lining, barely visible unless you know where to look, is a faded unit patch. 75th Ranger Regiment. Ranger tan and black, the scroll worn at the edges from hands that have touched it 1,000 times, usually alone, usually at 3 in the morning when sleep won't come. Derek Voss notices her from the doorway. He's been noticing her for 2 weeks now, since that first Tuesday when she appeared on the staff roster with impeccable credentials and a blank social media footprint. His 37 carries himself with the weight of a man who's never been told no by anyone who mattered. His TSA operations manager badge catches the fluorescent light as he shifts his weight. His assistant, a nervous kid named Marcus, hovers 2 steps behind him. New girl's too curious, Voss mutters, not looking away from Megan as she opens a pharmaceutical shipment log. Marcus doesn't respond. He learned that response wasn't required. What Voss sees, a competent nurse doing inventory in a way that suggests she actually cares about patient safety. A woman in her early 30s with shoulders that seem smaller than they should be, dark hair pulled back tight, hands that move with practiced efficiency. What Voss doesn't see, the muscle memory of field tourniquets applied under mortar fire. The hands that have sewn wounds closed with suture kits in convoy vehicles. The years of living on 4 hours of sleep because the person in the bunk next to you might stop breathing and you be the only one awake to notice. Megan feels his stare. She doesn't react. She's good at not reacting. She photographs another pharmaceutical manifest page with her phone, angling the device so the light reflects off the screen naturally, not hiding, not obvious. Just careful. Documentation. Everything documented. Everything traceable. That's the Pentagon assignment. Not to stop the diversion. Not yet. First, to map it. Understand how much, how often, which contractors, which routes through the airport's cargo hub. Derek Voss manages medical supply logistics for San Antonio International. He's been skimming for 18 months. High-grade trauma supplies, lidocaine, epinephrine, hemostatic gauze, routed to a private contractor called Meridian Logistics. The contractor sells them on the grey market. Yemen. Syria. Places where questions don't get asked and payment arrives in cryptocurrency. $20,000 a month. Voss hasn't thought much about where the supplies end up. He's thought exclusively about the money. Until Megan O'Brien appeared. She closes the manifest log with a soft click. Looks up. Makes eye contact with Voss across the clinic waiting area. Her eyes are the color of cold Atlantic water, and they don't look away first. He does. Marcus, find out where that one came from, Voss says quietly. The new nurse. Personnel file. Everything. Yes, sir, Mr. Voss. Megan turns back to the crash cart, continues organizing. Her movements are unhurried. Perfect composure. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen, so nothing else registers as particularly threatening. She'd been trained by the Army's Special Operations Command to be invisible, to observe without being observed, to ask the questions that sound innocent when you're untrained but cut directly to the infrastructure of an operation when you actually understand logistics. The question started small. Where do the pharmaceutical shipments originate before they get here? Routine question, she made it sound. Just wondering about supply chain timing. Then, how long do they typically stay in the cargo hub before transfer? Just making conversation during lunch in the employee break room. Then, I've noticed the hemostatic gauze we stock here is different from what I saw at my last assignment. Different supplier. Innocent curiosity from a nurse who's worked at multiple hospitals. Except she hadn't. Her file said 2 years at Mercy General in San Antonio before this airport assignment. Her real file, the one at the Pentagon, said 3 tours of duty, 72 combat life-saving procedures under direct fire in Ramadi, 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star with Valor. That file said Captain Megan O'Brien, Army Special Operations Combat Medic, on detached duty investigating potential trafficking of military-grade medical supplies through civilian airports. Derek Voss knows none of this. What he knows is that the pharmaceutical manifests for the last 17 days are missing from the digital filing system, and the only person who's accessed that folder besides himself was the new trauma nurse. What he knows is that his contact at Meridian Logistics called yesterday asking if there was a security problem, because suddenly the supplies he was expecting didn't show up, and now he's very interested in knowing why. The rain starts without warning. Through the clinic's single high window, water hammers the tarmac outside like applause for a performance nobody's watching. Megan glances up, watching the rain streak the glass. There's something in her expression that Voss doesn't understand, not sadness, not fear. Recognition. Like she's seeing an old friend. She touches the place where the unit patch is sewn into her jacket lining. Just touches it. Barely a movement. Her fingers find it without looking, feel the worn fabric for 2 seconds, then her hand returns to the crash cart. The gesture takes 3 seconds. Nobody sees it. Nobody's supposed to see it. Voss watches from the doorway, trying to understand what he's looking at. There's something off about her. Something that doesn't fit the profile of a 3-month civilian trauma nurse who was placed by the medical staffing agency. The way she moves. The way she holds her shoulders. The way she didn't flinch when he stared at her. Mr. Voss, Marcus says quietly, I have the personnel file. Voss takes the folder without looking away from Megan. She's restocking gauze now, each package placed with mathematical precision into the crash cart side compartment. Not the way normal nurses stock supplies. The way someone stocks supplies when they've done it 1,000 times and muscle memory is all that's left of the person who taught them. Show me, Voss says. Marcus opens the folder. Nursing degree from University of Texas. License renewed annually for 6 years. 2 years at Mercy General in San Antonio, listed as emergency department staff. Clean employee history. No disciplinary records. No notes. References checked and confirmed. It's perfect. Which is the problem? It's too perfect. Real people have something in their files. A note about tardiness. A performance review with feedback. A previous employer comment. This file is clean the way government files are clean. The way a cover story is clean. Voss closes the folder. Pull the security camera footage from the pharmaceutical storage area. Last 3 weeks. Yes, sir. The rain continues outside. The fluorescent lights hum. Somewhere in the airport, a gate agent announces a flight to Dallas. Megan O'Brien finishes restocking the crash cart, checks it one final time, a habit from Ramadi when you never knew which supplies you wouldn't have next time you needed them, and closes the metal lid with a soft metallic click. She knows Voss is watching her. She knows he's beginning to understand that something doesn't align. She knows this is the moment he decides she's a problem, because Voss is the type of man who solves problems by eliminating them, and he doesn't yet understand that he's looking at someone who was trained to survive being treated as the enemy. What happens next doesn't just threaten Voss's kickback scheme. It brings the entire operation into focus for the first time, though neither of them knows it yet. Megan has been building a case in photographs, in documented questions, in a paper trail that leads directly from the medical supplies stocked in this clinic to a private contractor with ties to arms dealers in the Middle East. She has been doing it slowly, invisibly, the way the best investigations work, not with confrontation but with persistence. And Derek Voss has just decided that she's a threat who needs to be addressed. The rain hammers the windows. The fluorescent lights buzz their endless electronic song. In the cargo hub 2 terminals away, another pharmaceutical shipment is being logged, routed, redirected. The diversion continues. The money continues. Everything continues exactly as it has for 18 months. But the moment Voss looked at that perfect personnel file and decided Megan O'Brien was a problem, the countdown began. The humiliation campaign didn't start with violence. It started with a voice. Miss O'Brien. A word. Now. Derek Mercer stood in the doorway of exam room 3 like a man who owned the oxygen inside it. His TSA uniform was pressed sharp enough to cut, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights of San Antonio International Airport's medical clinic. Behind him, the waiting area fell silent. Conversation stopped. A child's toy clattered to the floor and stayed there. Megan O'Brien didn't look up from the chart she was updating. Her handwriting was precise, measured, the kind of penmanship that came from years of documentation that mattered. The kind where every letter had to survive scrutiny. She'd just finished stabilizing a 63-year-old diabetic passenger whose blood glucose had spiked to 400 during the flight from Denver. 4 hours ago, the man had been confused, dizzy, 1 step away from diabetic ketoacidosis. Now his glucose read 180, trending downward safely, his daughter holding his hand and whispering thank you repeatedly, the kind of gratitude that made clinic work bearable. Megan looked up slowly. Met Mercer's eyes. Didn't move. I've reviewed your credentials, Mercer said, and his voice was loud, deliberate in its volume. The waiting room could hear every word. Or what you claim are credentials. And frankly, I'm concerned we've got ourselves a Nurse Nightingale here. Playing doctor. Overstepping. Making decisions that should go through proper channels. The family in the room exchanged glances. The daughter's hand tightened on her father's shoulder. Megan set her pen down. The click against the clipboard was the only sound in the room besides the ventilator's soft wheeze in the adjacent bay and the fluorescent hum overhead, that constant electrical drone that never stopped, never paused, like the sound of a machine that had forgotten how to rest. Your certification documents, Mercer continued, stepping fully into the room now, positioning himself between Megan and the door. The body language of a man who controlled exits. I don't see them in your file. Show me. Right now. Because if they're not there, we have a serious problem, and it's your problem. Megan stood. She was smaller than Mercer by 6 inches and probably 80 pounds, which meant nothing. Strength wasn't measured in inches. She'd learned that in Ramadi, where she'd been 5'6" and had held a grown man's open femoral artery together for 19 minutes while the dust settled around them like ash. She took 1 measured breath through her nose. Those documents were filed twice, sir, she said quietly. Her voice was the kind of calm that came from knowing how to survive things. Once when I was hired. Once when you requested them last month. Both times with receipts. I'm certain any review board would find that interesting. A single tear escaped her left eye. Not from fear. Not from anger. Just from the physical fact of having been alive long enough to understand that some men mistake silence for weakness, and some men would never know the difference. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, drumming against the airport steel-reinforced windows like fingernails on a coffin lid. The daughter stared at Megan. The father, the retired ranger whose blood sugar she'd just saved, stared at Megan. Mercer's jaw tightened, and he turned away because he couldn't bear being looked at like that, like she'd just revealed something about him he didn't want to see. We'll see, he said. Review board. We'll see what they have to say about your personnel file. He left. The door closed behind him with a pneumatic hiss. The daughter exhaled. Thank you, she said again. Thank you for knowing what to do. For not hesitating. Megan nodded once and finished her documentation. Her hand was completely steady as she wrote, each letter perfect, each note legal, each entry the kind of record that would survive any scrutiny because it had been written by someone who understood that documentation was armor. She'd learned that in a field hospital in Helmand province where the records mattered more than the bodies, where paperwork was the only proof that the lives you'd saved had actually existed. 2 days passed. 48 hours of normal clinic work. Blood pressure checks. Medication reconciliation. A sprained ankle. A migraine. A passenger with chest pain who turned out to have acid reflux but still required a full EKG and documentation. Megan moved through each patient with the same precision, the same calm, the kind of efficiency that made her invisible in the way that excellence sometimes did. Then came Friday morning, and she arrived at the clinic to find the break room transformed into a geography lesson in exclusion. The 4 other nurses on rotation, Patricia, Susan, Jennifer, and Kyle, sat at the break room table with their lunches, their conversations dropping to hisses the moment Megan opened the door. She wasn't looking at them. She opened the refrigerator, pulled out her lunch container, and turned to find a seat. The conversation had stopped completely. 4 heads turned toward her simultaneously, and then Patricia stood, gathered her tray, and began walking toward the hallway. Susan followed. Jennifer gathered her water bottle. Kyle stayed seated for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make it look like his own choice, then he stood too, leaving the smell of his coffee behind like evidence. Megan sat alone at the table. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the rotor wash of a helicopter shook the clinic's windows as a medical transport lifted from the helipad across the parking lot. San Antonio traffic hummed on the roadways beyond the airport's perimeter. The world continued, indifferent to break room geography. She ate her lunch. Turkey sandwich. Apple. The taste of each bite was exactly what it should have been, which meant nothing at all. By Friday afternoon, something had been posted on the personnel board in the main corridor where passengers could see it while they waited for connecting flights. The board held flight information, clinic hours, emergency numbers. And now it held a document printed on official airport authority letterhead. Disciplinary notice. T.O.M. O'Brien, R.N. From Operations Management. Date, Friday's date. Subject, failure to follow chain of command regarding supply requisitions. Details of violation noted in personnel file. Documentation of unauthorized requests for pharmaceutical manifests noted as of the date. Recommend immediate review of credentials and scope of practice. Megan stood before the board. The hallway behind her was empty except for a businessman rolling a carry-on toward the gates and an elderly couple waiting for their daughter to pick them up. None of them looked at her. She photographed the notice with her phone, 3 angles, the light catching the official seal, the date, her name printed in bold like a warning or a prophecy. Her jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough that someone trained to read faces would have seen it. She turned and walked away, her movements the same as always, steady, purposeful, the kind of walk that didn't invite conversation or comment. But that wasn't the worst part. The supply requisitions the notice referenced, the ones about pharmaceutical manifests, those were the ones that were genuine. Those were the ones that mattered. Those were the documentation of the cargo anomaly she'd been assigned to investigate. The Pentagon operation that was supposed to remain invisible. The trafficking diversion scheme that Mercer had been profiting from, that Mercer had just inadvertently made part of her official disciplinary record, turning her legitimate investigation into an apparent violation of protocol. Mercer had just weaponized the truth against her without understanding that he was weaponizing the truth. He'd looked at her perfect documentation and seen threat, and he'd documented his own suspicion in a way that would be visible, tangible, and archived forever in the airport's personnel system. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, Megan sat in the dark with her phone and opened the photo of her unit. 12 faces. She'd crossed out 4 of them with a pen in 2009. Then 3 more in 2011. Then 2 more in different operations, different years, different deserts where the heat rose from the ground like the breath of something dying beneath the sand. Her hand trembled only then, in the privacy of darkness where no one could see. By Monday morning, Mercer had made 3 phone calls. The first was to the airport authority's chief of operations. The second was to the nursing agency that had placed her. The third was to a contact he had somewhere in the Department of Defense, a contact whose exact relationship to Mercer would remain unclear, but whose existence was about to change everything. And on Tuesday afternoon, a man in a faded Army Ranger cap was going to collapse near Gate B17, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his daughter screaming for help, and Megan was going to perform a procedure in front of 50 witnesses that would blow her cover wide open. She was going to save his life and end her assignment simultaneously, unaware that the man she was saving had the authority to make phone calls of his own, the kind of calls that made generals answer. But that moment was still one day away. For now, in the quiet Monday morning before the crisis, Megan sat in her apartment and scrolled through the personnel system on her secure laptop, documenting everything that Mercer had done, every action he'd taken, every strategic move that proved he was far more competent at manipulation than a simple bully. She was building a case file. Not for herself. For the investigation. Pain was information. Everything was data. And sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one holding it all together. The gate collapse happened at 2:38 p.m. By 3:15 p.m., Derek Voss was already on his office phone, the door closed, the blinds drawn tight. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk like a predator testing its cage. She had moved without hesitation. She had moved like someone trained. And worse, she had saved a life in front of 17 witnesses while he watched from across the terminal, unable to stop it. The veteran's daughter had seen the whole thing. So had the TSA screeners. So had the Cinnabon attendant at Gate B17. 17 pairs of eyes had watched Megan O'Brien perform a needle decompression with a precision that made the senior nurse look like she was still learning basic vitals. The 14-gauge catheter had gone in clean. The hiss of air escaping the pleural cavity had sounded like a sigh of relief. The man's oxygen saturation had climbed from 68 to 88 in 90 seconds flat. Dead silence in the terminal. Then applause. Voss had felt something crack inside his chest, not concern. Control. He lifted the phone and dialed the direct line for the airport authority chief of operations, a man named Richardson who owed him favors going back 7 years. Richardson. Voss from operations. His voice came out smooth, calibrated, the voice of someone protecting institutional interests. We have a liability situation developing at the medical clinic. I need your authorization for an immediate investigation. On the other end, Richardson's coffee cup clinked against his desk. What kind of situation? An authorized invasive procedure performed by a civilian clinic nurse without physician oversight or documented authorization. Performed in a public area. On a passenger. Voss let that settle. Textbook scope of practice violation. If that passenger develops complications, infection, secondary pneumothorax, vocal cord damage, we're looking at $1 million liability exposure. Maybe more. Richardson's silence stretched for 3 seconds. Voss knew what he was thinking: lawsuits, regulatory fines, joint commission investigations. The airport authority's insurance was already expensive. One settlement would double the premiums. You're certain? Richardson asked. Witnessed by airport personnel. I'm documenting everything now. Another lie, smooth as silk. I'd recommend immediate suspension pending disciplinary review. We need to show the FAA we take scope violations seriously. By 3:36 p.m., Voss had made his second call. To the nursing agency that had placed Megan at the clinic 6 months ago, Travel Care Medical Staffing, a company that collected their 20% commission whether their nurses succeeded or failed. The agency director, a woman named Patricia Chen, answered on the second ring. Patricia. Derek Voss, TSA Operations. We need to discuss one of your placed employees. He'd already pulled up Megan's file on his computer: 3 months of clinic assignments, vaccination records, 2 employment verifications, a background check from a firm he recognized as standard issue. Megan O'Brien. I need her complete personnel file. Academic records. Previous placements. Any disciplinary history. Full background workup. Derek, that's not a request, Patricia. We're opening an investigation into scope violations. I need everything you have. Today. He hung up before she could ask more questions. The beauty of bureaucracy was that people feared consequences more than they questioned authority. A TSA manager invoking an investigation was a shape in the dark. No one wanted to ask too many questions about what it might become. The third move was the masterpiece. By 4:15 p.m., Voss had assembled a disciplinary panel. He called Dr. Michael Ashford, the airport clinic's medical director, a man who'd been quietly grateful 6 months ago when Voss had used some discreet connections to ensure that his DUI arrest from a weekend in Austin never made it into his employment file. One phone call to the right people, one favor from the right sheriff's deputy, and a potential career ender had simply evaporated. Ashford owed Voss more than money could measure. Michael. Emergency Disciplinary Panel. 6 p.m. Conference Room C. Voss didn't wait for a response. Megan O'Brien. Scope violation. We need documentation of unauthorized procedure, witness statements, and a termination recommendation. He called HR next. Compliance officer named Sandra Lowe. She'd been receiving premium event tickets for 3 months, symphony galas, Cowboys games, the kind of entertainment that looked innocent on an expense report but felt like luxury to someone making $62,000 a year. The tickets came through a contractor relationship that Voss had carefully cultivated. The same contractor whose pharmaceutical diversion operation Megan had apparently been documenting. Sandra. Disciplinary hearing, 6 p.m. I'm sending you scope violation documentation. You'll want to have her personnel file present. Any previous complaints? Any evidence of overstepping? He kept his voice level, administrative. This one's straightforward. We just need the paperwork to be airtight. By 4:02 p.m., Voss had made his final call. To the medical supply contractor, Mercer Logistics, coincidentally sharing his surname, run by a man named James Mercer who paid Voss $40,000 a month in consulting fees for information about incoming pharmaceutical shipments. The kickback scheme was simple. Mercer Logistics would mark high-value narcotics and antibiotics for standard warehousing, Voss would flag them as cleared, and they'd vanish into a secondary distribution network that moved product to clinics across the Rio Grande. Over 6 months, they'd moved approximately $800,000 worth of controlled medications. The profit margin was astronomical. James. We have a problem. Airport clinic nurse named O'Brien. She's been asking questions about pharmaceutical manifests, flight manifests, cargo routing protocols. Voss kept his voice low, even though his office door was locked. I'm moving on her now. Disciplinary panel at 6. But I wanted you to know. She's a threat to the operation. James Mercer's breathing sounded heavy on the other end. How big a threat? I don't know yet. But she moves and talks like someone with training. Like someone asking specific questions about specific shipments. Then she disappears, James said simply. No. Not yet. That creates complications. Let me handle this first. Bureaucratic pressure. Professional humiliation. Job loss. Sometimes people just break under the weight of it. By 5:15 p.m., Voss had moved to his fourth strategic play. He'd walked directly to the clinic and found Megan in the supply room, restocking medication trays. Without a word, he'd pulled her access badge from her lanyard while she was reaching for the top shelf. The badge was how she logged pharmacy requisitions. It was how she accessed the supply manifest database. It was her digital fingerprint on every document she reviewed. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to front desk intake, he said. The words came out clipped, professional. No access to controlled substances. No access to supply ordering. Senior staff only. I'll have your access codes revoked within the hour. Megan had turned, her hand still mid-reach. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She simply lowered her hand and looked at him, really looked at him, with an expression so calm it made his skin prickle. Like she was reading something written in his bones. "Understood," she said quietly. But her eyes had already started cataloguing details. The tremor in Voss's left hand. The sweat line at his collar. The way his pupils had dilated, not from anger, but from adrenaline. From fear. She recognized the signs of someone operating at the edge of panic while trying to project control. She'd seen it in soldiers preparing for operations they weren't sure they'd survive. At 5:27 p.m., Patricia Chen from Travel Care Staffing knocked on the clinic's administrative office door. She looked like she hadn't slept in 48 hours. She handed over Megan's complete file, academic records from the University of Texas at Austin, 3 years of nursing school with honors grades, vaccination records, background clearance, 2 reference letters from previous employers that were almost suspiciously glowing. Previous placements in Houston, Dallas, El Paso. Clean record. Excellent performance evaluations. Patricia wouldn't meet Megan's eyes when Megan passed her in the hallway. At 6:15 p.m., Megan sat in the airport security office with a view of the conference room through a glass partition. She watched them assemble like pieces on a chessboard. Dr. Ashford, looking uncomfortable. Sandra Lowe from HR, carrying a thick folder. A third man she didn't recognize, probably a consultant from the contractor. And Derek Voss at the center of the table, arranging papers with the precision of someone preparing a prosecution. Her phone buzzed. A text from an encrypted number. "Do not break cover. Investigation takes priority." Her Pentagon handler. Her handler who'd placed her here 6 weeks ago with explicit instructions to document pharmaceutical diversions through the cargo hub without revealing her identity. Her handler who didn't know that she'd already captured manifest discrepancies, requisition anomalies, and the specific routing patterns that would take down at least 3 people and potentially a much larger operation. But revealing her rank would terminate the investigation. Would scatter the evidence. Would let the trafficking network evaporate like morning fog. She watched through the glass as Dr. Ashford reviewed papers. As Sandra Lowe opened the folder. As Voss began to speak, gesturing at the documents before him like he was laying out a case against a criminal. The rain started then. Not forecast. Just sudden. Hammering against the terminal windows like applause, like judgment, like the universe was keeping time with the beating of her own heart. She could see Voss's reflection in the glass partition. Smiling. Confident. Believing he'd just executed a perfect trap. 6 weeks of work. 72 hours of documented supply inconsistencies. A pharmaceutical diversion scheme that went up at least 4 levels of authority. And she was about to walk into a room and surrender everything because a man with $40,000 a month in blood money was afraid of her questions. The panel's summons came at 6:51 p.m. A security officer knocked on the office door. "Miss O'Brien. They're ready for you." She stood. Straightened her scrubs. Walked toward the conference room with the same measured pace she'd used to approach the veterans' collapsed form at Gate B-17. There was a sound, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the rain hammering harder against the windows, the soft click of her shoes on the tile floor. 3 sounds layering over each other like a composition written in fury. She opened the conference room door and stepped inside. Voss sat center, flanked by his assembled allies, a stack of fabricated documentation spread before him like a royal flush. "Miss O'Brien," he began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "This is a termination hearing." Gate B-17 erupted into chaos at 2:44 p.m. The elderly man in the faded Army Ranger cap had been waiting for his connecting flight when his breathing changed, shallow, then frantic, then desperate. His chest heaved against an invisible weight. His skin turned the color of old pennies. Security called the clinic. Megan was in the break room, fingers wrapped around lukewarm coffee, when Patricia burst through the door, Gate B medical emergency. Now. She moved without hesitation. The man lay on the terminal floor, surrounded by concerned travelers and TSA officers speaking into radios. Megan dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already reading the story his body was telling. Hyperinflated chest. Trachea shifted visibly toward his left shoulder. Neck veins distended like cables under skin. The senior clinic nurse, Rebecca, stood frozen with a radio in her hand, saying into it, "Ambulance ETA 12 minutes. We have a medical professional on scene." 12 minutes was 8 minutes too long. What happened? Megan's voice was level, authoritative, the voice the man had been waiting his whole life to hear. Couldn't breathe. Just couldn't. His gasps were wet, panicked. Tension pneumothorax. The air pocket between his lung and chest wall was compressing his heart. Every breath made it worse. Every second his oxygen dropped lower, 88, 82, 78, the numbers ticking down like a timer on a bomb that only she could defuse. "I need the crash cart. Now." Not a request. A command that made Rebecca move. The cart arrived in 17 seconds. Megan's hands had already catalogued what she needed: 14-gauge angiocath needle, alcohol pad, the anatomical landmarks etched into her muscle memory from 147 previous procedures, 73 of them under fire in Ramadi with rounds snapping overhead and the wet sound of bleeding soldiers around her. This man didn't know he was being treated by someone who had performed emergency decompression in convoy ambushes, in forward surgical tents, in the back of a Black Hawk descending into a hot landing zone. His chest expanded with shallow panic. She didn't hesitate. Didn't ask permission. Her fingers located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical sweet spot where a needle could reach the pleural space and save a life. The alcohol pad was cool against his skin for half a second. Then she positioned the needle, not tentative, not searching, but confident with the terrifying precision of someone who knew exactly where to place it. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was immediate, the sound of pressure releasing, of survival becoming possible again. The man gasped, and this time his lungs could actually expand. His eyes flew open. Color began to creep back into his face. O2 climbing. 68, 74. 81, 88. She secured the needle with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the specific neurological aftermath of adrenaline and muscle memory, the trained body's tremor after executing something perfect under impossible pressure. Rebecca stared at her. The gathering crowd went silent. The man's breathing steadied, became almost normal, and he looked up at Megan with the clarity of someone being given back his life. His hand found her wrist. "That's a Ramadi technique," he whispered hoarsely. "Who taught you to decompress like that?" She met his eyes for one moment. Held the contact. Then, "Glad you're breathing, sir." But that moment of eye contact had registered. The man had trained in Ramadi. Had served. Had recognized the specific procedural approach, the confidence, the speed, the anatomical precision, as something beyond standard nursing protocol. Something military. Something that had saved lives in desert heat under completely different circumstances. Derek Mercer arrived at Gate B at 17 exactly 90 seconds after the needle decompression. He'd been in his office, monitoring the terminal feeds through his network of TSA personnel, when he saw the commotion. He'd understood immediately: an emergency, a procedure, Megan involved. The opportunity crystallized in his mind like a photograph developing in chemical solution. This wasn't a problem anymore. This was salvation. This was the leverage he needed. He pushed through the crowd, badge visible, authority radiating outward like a weapon. The man was conscious now, stable, the needle taped carefully in place. Rebecca was calling for a stretcher. Megan was washing her hands at the terminal water fountain, her composure absolute, her jaw slightly clenched, the only visible sign of the intensity she'd just executed. Mercer's voice cut through the terminal noise like a blade. "Who performed this procedure?" Megan straightened. Water dripped from her hands. She didn't shake it off. "I did, sir. Without physician authorization. The patient was in critical condition. Ambulance was 12 minutes out. That's not your decision to make. He turned to security. Document everything. Patient statement. Procedure timeline. Nurse identification. Back to Megan, you're to report to my office immediately after this patient is transported. This is a serious violation of scope of practice. She nodded once. Said nothing. Let him fill the silence with his own significance, his own sense of power restored. But as he walked back toward the administrative corridor, his hands were already on his phone. 3 calls. Sequenced perfectly. First to the Airport Authority Chief of Operations, we have a liability situation. Unauthorized medical procedure performed by clinic staff. Recommend immediate suspension. Second to the nursing staffing agency, need her complete personnel file. All references, background, everything. Possible misconduct. Third to HR, emergency disciplinary panel. Tonight. 6 p.m. This can't wait. The 4th call was to the contractor whose pharmaceutical shipment scheme Megan's investigation was slowly, methodically dismantling. 1 encrypted voice message, our mutual problem solved herself. Handle the network accordingly. By 4:15 p.m., Megan sat in a small grey conference room on the airport's administrative level, facing Mercer, Dr. Ashford from Occupational Health, and an HR representative whose name Megan didn't register. The disciplinary panel. 17 minutes that felt like hours stretched against the clock. Unauthorized procedure, Mercer began, his tone rehearsed. Pattern of insubordination. Failure to follow chain of command. The HR representative nodded. Dr. Ashford looked at a document that contained procedure details Megan had correctly documented the moment the man was stable. Your nursing credentials don't authorize emergency decompression in an airport terminal, Dr. Ashford said quietly. That's surgical intervention. The patient would have died, Megan said. Not defensive. Factual. Ambulance was 12 minutes away. Tension pneumothorax at that pressure. We understand the medical rationale, the HR representative interrupted. But the protocol requires physician authorization before advanced procedures. There was no physician available. Which is why we have protocols. Mercer leaned forward slightly, and Megan saw the pleasure in his face, the satisfaction of someone delivering punishment cloaked in institutional necessity. Your agency has been contacted. Your access to the clinic is revoked effective immediately. We're recommending termination based on pattern of unauthorized practice and insubordination. The room didn't spin. The walls didn't close in. Megan's hands didn't tremble, her voice didn't crack. She sat very still, letting the words land, processing the mathematics of the situation. The investigation was incomplete, the pharmaceutical shipment arrived in 48 hours, 1 more collection of manifests would prove the entire diversion scheme, and if she called the Pentagon now, if she revealed captain status and SICE authorization, the entire 3-month operation collapsed. The contractors would scatter. The kickback network would evaporate. The trafficking scheme would go dormant and reorganize under different names. She made the choice without speaking it aloud. Standing slowly, she unclipped her hospital ID badge from her scrub pocket. The plastic caught the fluorescent light. She set it on the conference table with a soft click that sounded like surrender. Her keycard followed. She didn't look at the badge as she signed the termination paperwork, her signature perfectly steady, muscle memory from 1,000 military documents, signatures that had authorized operations and supply requisitions and casualty reports. Security will escort you out, Mercer said, unable to hide the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The walk through San Antonio International felt endless. Past the gate where the ranger sat in a wheelchair, waiting for his delayed transport to Houston. Past the clinic where Patricia carefully looked away, suddenly fascinated by the computer screen in front of her. Past the break room where the other nurses whispered, she heard her name, heard the word insubordination, heard the small sound of professional validation that came when a threat was eliminated. Security escorted her to the employee break room to collect her locker. The contents fit in a cardboard box, a cracked coffee mug with the Ranger tab insignia, almost transparent with age, a dying succulent she'd been trying to keep alive on a windowsill beside the lockers, and a photograph in a plastic frame, her Ramadi unit, 12 faces arranged in 3 rows, August 2019, before the rotations that had reduced them. 7 of the faces were now crossed through with marker. 7 of 12. The losses had a weight that didn't change, no matter how much time passed. The rain started at 5:43 p.m. Megan stood at the bus stop outside departures, holding the disintegrating cardboard box, water soaking through in spreading dark patches. Her phone buzzed, secured Pentagon line, encrypted, stand down. We'll find another way. There was no other way. There never was. This was how operations failed, not with fanfare, but with quiet surrender, with the recognition that the price of completion was higher than the cost of walking away. She'd known it the moment Mercer's voice cut through the crowd at gate B17. She'd known it when he made his 3 consecutive calls. She'd known it when she walked into that conference room and saw the predetermined outcome in their faces. A bus pulled up, doors hissing open like the pneumothorax releasing. The driver waited. Megan didn't move, just stood in the rain, the photograph of her Ramadi unit already beginning to blur through the cardboard's disintegrating fibers, watching the taillights of airport traffic blur into red watercolor streaks. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, Derek Mercer conducted a triumphant walkthrough of the clinic, mentally rehearsing the explanation he'd give the licensing board about Megan's departure, voluntary resignation due to policy disputes. Of course, when Patricia called out, "Mr. Mercer, there's a patient asking for the nurse from yesterday." The elderly ranger stood at the clinic desk, moving stiffly but upright, his daughter supporting his arm. His name was Colonel James Hendricks, retired, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 tours, 2 Purple Hearts, and the moment he saw Mercer's face, something in his expression changed, the shift from grateful patient to something harder, more tactical. "I'm looking for the young nurse," Colonel Hendricks said quietly. The one who knew exactly what to do at gate B17. Patricia stammered that she was no longer employed there. "She's gone." His jaw tightened. "Since when?" "Yesterday. After the incident." Colonel Hendricks went very still, and his daughter felt the sudden tension running through his shoulders. "Show me the medical report she filed." Airport police pulled the documentation from the system. Hendricks stared at the signature line, reading the name once, then twice, his eyes narrowing. When he looked up, it wasn't with gratitude anymore. It was with recognition. "Find her," he said flatly. "Now." "Sir, she was terminated." "I don't care if she was." He stopped himself, took a deliberate breath, modulating the command tone back to something that wouldn't alarm security. "Please. Find her. And call your operations chief. We need him here immediately." He pulled out his phone, stepped away, made one call. Megan heard him say only, "It's her. San Antonio International." "Yes, I'm certain. The technique confirms it. Ramadi signature." Within the hour, Megan was standing at the bus stop, still holding the disintegrating box, when 2 officers in army dress uniform approached. Not TSA. Army. She recognized the insignia before they spoke. "Captain O'Brien?" The rain had soaked through the cardboard completely. The photograph of her unit was nearly illegible now. She set the box down slowly. "You need to come back inside," the taller officer said. Not a request. The same tone Mercer used, but carrying the weight of actual authority. Derek Mercer intercepted them at the clinic entrance, his smirk already spreading. "I'm sorry, but this individual is no longer employed by." He stopped. Colonel Hendricks approached Megan, and during the commotion of the officers stepping aside, her jacket fell open. The faded 75th Ranger Regiment unit patch that she'd sewn inside the lining 17 years ago, small, barely visible, the kind of detail that only another Ranger would recognize, caught the fluorescent light. Hendricks saw it, and his entire bearing shifted. He stepped closer, read the insignia, and whispered, "Valkyrie." The terminal seemed to hold its breath. The taller officer unfolded a citation document, his voice steady and carrying through the clinic and into the surrounding airport, Captain Megan O'Brien. United States Army. The rain came sideways that night, hammering the bus shelter like machine gun fire on corrugated metal. Megan stood motionless under the overhang, her cardboard box clutched against her chest like a fallen comrade. Inside, a cracked coffee mug with a Ranger tab faded almost invisible, a dying succulent she'd watered exactly once, and a photograph. The photograph was the weight that mattered. Ramadi, summer of 2019. 14 faces arranged in 2 rows, desert tan uniforms bleached nearly white by the sun. Megan stood third from the left, eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, hands already steady from holding wounds closed. Half the faces had been marked through with black pen. X through Martinez. X through Kowalski. X through Chen. 14 people in one photograph. 7 had come home. 7 had not. She stared at the surviving faces, her face included, and felt the old familiar weight settle in her chest like a stone sinking through water. A traveler rushed past without seeing her, pulling a rolling suitcase, already halfway to somewhere else. The world moved. The world always moved. Only Megan stood still in the rain, holding the cardboard box like it contained the last 3 months of her life. It did. The next morning, Derek Mercer arrived at San Antonio International Airport at 6:11 a.m., 20 minutes before the day staff clocked in. His step was light. His spine was straight. His smile was the smile of a man who'd successfully removed a problem and was already planning how to explain it to the licensing board. The termination of Captain Megan O'Brien, or rather, the termination of the nurse Megan O'Brien, the records would only show the civilian name. The cover, the discarded skin, would be classified as voluntary resignation due to personal circumstances. No liability. No lawsuit. No investigation. Mercer had made calls. Mercer had made arrangements. Mercer had already begun the narrative. He walked through the clinic corridor with his hands in his pockets, whistling, past the treatment bays where the medical staff was beginning their morning setup. The fluorescent lights hummed their pale electric song. Everything was normal. Everything was under control. That was what Mercer believed at 6:11 a.m. on a Tuesday in San Antonio, with rain still dripping from the terminal's metal gutters outside. He had 43 minutes of that belief remaining. At 7:31 a.m., a man in a pressed Army Ranger uniform walked through the airport's main entrance with his daughter, a woman in her early 30s carrying flowers. The man's name was Colonel James Hendricks, United States Army, retired, with the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years making life and death decisions under fire. His left arm was missing below the elbow, a souvenir from Kandahar, 2011, but he moved through the terminal with the terrifying fluid precision of a person who'd already survived the worst and had nothing left to fear. His daughter held his good hand, both of them heading toward the airport medical clinic with purpose written into their posture. Colonel Hendricks had spent the previous evening in a hospital bed, conscious and articulate, explaining to the cardiologist that if it wasn't for the young nurse at the airport who'd known exactly what to do when his chest seized, he'd have died in a terminal gate area surrounded by strangers. His daughter had documented everything. Called the clinic. Found the name in the incident report, Megan O'Brien, trauma nurse. They were coming to thank her. They had flowers. They had a speech prepared. What they didn't know was that they were about to dismantle a career, expose a criminal enterprise, and unlock a classified Pentagon operation with a single conversation. The glass doors hissed open. The rain-dampened air rolled in. Colonel Hendricks and his daughter walked forward, flowers in hand, completely unaware they were about to become the hinge on which everything turned. The airport police officer pulled up Megan's incident report on the clinic's database at 7:43 a.m., scanning the medical documentation Colonel Hendricks had requested. Standard format. Procedure code. Vital signs progression. Patient outcome, improved stability, transferred to regional cardiology. And then the signature line at the bottom. That's when the colonel's hand tightened slightly, the way it had learned to grip the world with only 4 fingers. He looked up from the screen, jaw moving without sound, processing something the rest of the room hadn't yet registered. He turned to the officer. "Find her. Now. I don't care what shift she's on or where she is. Find Captain Megan O'Brien and tell her I need 10 minutes. The officer blinked. "Sir, that's not a request." The voice came out the same way it had come out in Ramadi when giving orders that meant people would either live or die in the next 60 seconds. The tone was not negotiable. The officer was already on the radio before the sentence finished. 30 seconds later, Patricia from the clinic appeared in the hallway, her face suddenly grey. "He's not here. Megan was terminated yesterday. Derek Mercer fired her during a disciplinary hearing. She cleaned out her locker around 4 p.m. I tried to, but Colonel Hendricks was already pulling his phone from his jacket pocket, the motion smooth despite the missing hand, the phone balanced against his shoulder while his remaining 4 fingers found the keypad. One number. 3 digits. The kind of call that takes 90 seconds to place and 90 days to recover from. "This is Colonel James Hendricks, retired, 75th Ranger Regiment. I need to speak with whoever's handling airport security operations. And I mean whoever." The pause was infinitesimal. He was being transferred. The person on the other end recognized the name and the tone and the absolute certainty that they were about to become part of something much larger than their morning had planned for. "Tell me everything," the colonel said quietly. "Tell me what happened to Captain O'Brien." 1 hour later, at 8:54 a.m., to be precise, the glass doors at San Antonio International Airport's secure entrance slid open and Megan stepped through, escorted by 2 uniformed officers whose pairing made it clear they weren't airport security. They were military police. The taller one had the permanent posture of someone who'd spent years in the 160th SAW, the Army's Special Operations Helicopter Unit, the kind of bearing that made air move differently around you. Megan's cardboard box had been left at a storage locker. She wore her civilian scrubs, dark blue, still bearing the faded embroidered logo of St. Michael's Clinic, and her face showed absolutely no reaction to the 2 officers flanking her, the way she was being walked back into the terminal like a prisoner in reverse, like someone being reclaimed. Derek Mercer stood near the clinic entrance, smirking, already framing the narrative about security overreach and civilian medical staff needing to understand protocol. He was about to object, actually open his mouth to lodge a complaint about procedures and the absolute right of airport management to terminate problematic employees, when Colonel Hendricks approached. The colonel moved like a knife through still water, fluid and inevitable. He was close enough now that Megan could see his eyes, the color of old slate, the texture of a person who'd made peace with the worst parts of human nature and decided to carry on anyway. His daughter stood just behind him, still holding flowers, still not entirely understanding what was about to happen. The colonel's intact hand reached toward Megan's jacket. Toward the interior seam. Toward the place where, for 3 months, she'd kept the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. The 75th Ranger Regiment. Black and gold. The insignia of the only family that mattered anymore. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he leaned closer, close enough that only Megan could hear, and whispered a single word, "Valkyrie." The airport went very still. Not silent, airports never went silent, but still in the way that happened when everyone sensed something fundamental had just shifted. The taller MP officer unfolded the citation, the paper crisp and official, bearing the seal of the United States Army. His voice carried across the terminal, "Captain Megan O'Brien, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment. This commendation recognizes your service as a combat medic during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Army Commendation Medal. For actions in Ramadi, where you performed 72 combat life-saving procedures under direct fire, including emergency field amputation, tactical tourniquet application, and frontline trauma stabilization that resulted in the survival of 18 soldiers who would otherwise have perished. Each medal was a separate sentence. Each name landed like ordnance. Bronze Star. Pause. Purple Heart. Longer pause. Army Commendation Medal. The terminal held its breath. Passengers stopped walking. A woman with a coffee cup lowered it slowly to her side. Derek Mercer's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. He sputtered, actually sputtered, about protocols and jurisdiction and TSA authority overriding military credentials and this being insane and completely inappropriate. The words tumbled out with no power behind them. I was protecting this airport. She was the one asking questions about shipments. She was the one behaving suspiciously. I was doing my job. His voice climbed. Higher. Thinner. A man being buried under the weight of something he couldn't move. That's when the Brigadier General entered through the secure corridor, a woman with iron-grey hair and the kind of bearing that made even colonels stand a little straighter. She took one look at Megan's uniform, at the medals arranged perfectly on her chest, and rendered a full salute, fist to heart, the kind of salute you only gave to someone who'd earned it in blood. Captain O'Brien, she said, her voice precisely modulated. General Victoria Strand, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We've been monitoring San Antonio International for 6 weeks investigating pharmaceutical diversion through the cargo terminal. Your photographs, your documented observations, and your meticulous documentation of supply chain anomalies provided critical evidence. However, what truly completed our investigation was Derek Mercer himself. Every email he sent demanding access restrictions. Every call he made to vendors. Every requisition record he authorized. His own weapons detonated in his hands. 2 CICE agents emerged from the corridor, walking with the unhurried confidence of people who'd already won. One of them produced handcuffs, and the sound they made, that small metallic click, seemed to echo through the entire terminal. The cuffs went on Derek Mercer's wrists. He didn't resist. He couldn't. The world had simply realigned around him, and there was no way to argue his way back to where he'd been. You have the right to remain silent, one agent began, and Mercer's protests faded into the background noise of the airport, just another voice among thousands, already irrelevant. The medical director who'd approved suspicious pharmaceutical shipments slipped away from the clinic, but CICE agents were already waiting at the exits. Patricia, the nurse who'd been forced to isolate Megan by the weight of institutional pressure, approached with tears streaming down her face. I didn't know. I thought you were. I should have stood up for you. I'm so sorry. Her voice broke on the last word. Megan's composure, the thing that had held her together through humiliation and harassment and the slow methodical destruction of her cover, finally showed the smallest fracture. Moisture rimmed her eyes. Not tears. Almost tears. The difference between survival and breaking. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. Deepened. The voice of a woman who'd stopped pretending. You couldn't have known. Colonel Hendricks moved closer. His hand, his remaining hand, clasped her shoulder with the grip of someone who understood what she carried. Ramadi, summer of 2019. You pulled my executive officer out of a burning Humvee. Captain Sarah Chen. She made it home because of you. She told me about Valkyrie. The medic who wouldn't leave anyone behind. Megan's jaw tightened. Sir, I lost 14. The words came from the deepest place, the place where Captain O'Brien kept the things she couldn't afford to acknowledge while wearing scrubs and pretending to be someone else. You saved 58. The general's voice cut through like a blade of absolute certainty. The pharmaceutical operation alone compromised medication intended for combat hospital trauma bays. Your investigation prevented $40,000 in diverted supplies from reaching the black market. 3 contractors. 2 customs officials. 1 clinic director at Lackland Air Force Base. The entire network. She briefed Megan quietly, away from the gathering crowd of passengers and staff. The shipment arrives tonight. We have everything. Your work. His records. The testimony. You can stand down now, Captain. Your assignment is complete. Megan watched Derek Mercer being led away in handcuffs, still protesting, still not comprehending that every move he'd made against her, every write-up, every call to her references, every demand for documentation, had built the case that destroyed him. His own weapon had detonated in his hands. Rain drummed against the terminal's exterior walls. A departures board clicked and shuffled, updating flight times. The world moved on, as it always did, unaware that a classified operation had just concluded, not in caves or compounds but in an airport clinic, in break rooms, in the spaces between one breath and another. 14 months later, a local reporter doing a "Where Are They Now?" piece found Derek Mercer in a San Antonio community college, teaching CPR certification to nurses and paramedics, making $16 an hour plus whatever dignity he could salvage from teaching people to save lives. He still wore the same expression, confused, defensive, unable to comprehend how the quiet nurse he'd tried to destroy had been the agent who dismantled everything he'd built. Some men never understand that power isn't a title. Power is knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing restraint anyway. Subscribe, like, and comment. Tell us, have you ever underestimated someone who turned out to be exactly who you needed them to be?